There we are. I was reading. This is a little off topic. I was reading an article today.
Nothing's ever off topic.
Well, I was reading this article today, and the article was about due process in college.
Oh, okay.
And it's a lot about the Title IX laws and how on college campuses today there's a supposed rape culture. There may be, I can't say either way, although I don't think the statistics bear out what people say. But there's also a culture where the accused is brought almost into a tribunal without the facts in being able to defend himself or herself. And I was really stunned at how rumor and innuendo is used to almost sink the cases of the people who go before these star chambers. And that's exactly what they are. The people are practically guilty before. It's
interesting. It's sort of a flip on what it used to be is like, if there's a woman who accused a guy of rape, that they bring on the stand, say, well, didn't you, you've been sexually promiscuous.
All these other things, which was
character
ridiculous.
Assassination to invalidate her testimony of rape. So now it's sort of flipped. And it's like, well, you're accused of rape. Well, what about your, but this person's, there's a rumor, unsubstantiated, that you did this or that. And so rather than doing the facts of anything, it's just.
Rather than dealing with the facts and letting the names come up. Well, what's stunning to me is that even in cases where there's obviously doubt, I mean, if the reporting is accurate, assuming that the reporting on the case is accurate, and of course we don't know, but let's assume that it is accurate. In many of the cases, if the reporting is accurate, there's no way that you could bring a guilty verdict on in these cases. But what's happening is that
it's the standard is pretty low. It's not like a court case. Like if you went to court, there would be but it's whatever standard the school's deemed meets their threshold, which is just good enough to kick somebody out.
That's exactly right.
Expel them, but it's not a legal standard.
It is not
in a court.
And again, this is not to
it's their own standard. Yeah.
This is not to say that. This is not to disparage, people who bring allegations of rape, whether it be male or female. It's not to disparage or.
It should all be considered seriously.
It should be taken very seriously.
Very seriously. Which, unfortunately, in the past, it hasn't always been taken seriously. That's a very big problem.
But I think the way that these things are being adjudicated today are unhealthy.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of these cases that are being overturned with the universities having to pay out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is, in most of these cases, more power to you. If that's what it takes to get people to, have a consistent standard of justice.
We've got to get to a place where, the testimony from the woman who brings charges of rape is taken seriously, that it's, given due weight and value and due process, but also the testimony of the guy accused is also given
the same
due weight and proper evaluation, and there's no presumption of guilt on the part just because of the charge
or the severity of the charge.
It's unfortunate, but the culture has been messed up for a long time, and it continues to be, and we can't defend the way it was. It's not like go back to the way it was. It's
no, we can't do that
better.
Either.
It was terrible, but
I think
it's been sort of the pendulum swung the other way.
I think the reason why the pendulum has swung so far the other way is in these cases it's generally he said, she said,
which is,
and because it's he said, she said, that's always. If it really does boil down to one person's word against another,
so binary though. It could be he said, or she said, she said, or he, she said, or. Come on, Leroy. You're not really taking into consideration the present world.
There's
or they said,
or she said, and Jir said.
Yeah, you're assuming a gender pronoun in there, which is completely messed up.
That's probably because I'm a Christian and I think there's only two genders.
Well, there you go. I don't think there's any. I think there's two sexes and then genders.
Well, there's one, right. Well, I agree with that.
Social construct is made up, but that's a whole other
There's two sexes and one gender, right?
Yeah.
So.
Whatever, it's crazy.
Whatever,
so,
nuts,
so I thought about going into a little bit of Kavanaugh, SCOTUS.
Oh yeah, let's do that. I'm really excited
I might get into that. But before we do that, I wanted to mention one thing.
What's that?
So, off the cuff, we've been doing this now. This is episode 21.
Wow, 21 weeks.
And another one without Ward Crocker.
Yeah.
Which, like, at this point, he's missed like half of them.
And we don't really need Ward anyway. I mean,
yeah. I know, he doesn't even want, he's like, oh, I'm on vacation. Yeah. I have my time off.
He's with his kids and his wife and everything. Who cares? Who cares? Kids, what? Oh,
does he not even know how it makes me feel?
Your little heart is broken.
I know, my heart is broken. So anyway, episode 21, we're doing well. But I discovered, and I mentioned this, thing to you guys, YouTube, like they have done to PragerU, has, marked us as unclean for viewing of all viewers. And so they're suppressing our results. Right. We're restricted by them. I'm fairly certain, looking at the metrics of the back end information, that YouTube or Facebook has done the same thing. Mm-hmm. I think Google has done the same thing. So that's unfortunate. But if anybody listening, just a reminder, share our stuff around. Sure. The only way to get around that is through organic sort of sharing.
But that's exactly right.
And so we got to get people to do that, because it's really sad that we don't have an opportunity to get our opinion out there to be heard. Which is unfortunate. So,
well, that's the question that we were talking about. We at the seminary, we pay for ads on Facebook. We do because we think that there's some value in it. And even in my wife and I's ministry, we pay for ads. And as I started thinking about this whole thing, even before
Facebook ads, is what
particularly Facebook ads, even before. I started to wonder, why am I paying money for ads to people who are going to restrict the viewership of the content that I'm paying to get out there? And
it's problematic.
It's problematic.
Well, that's why Facebook's under lawsuits right now, because they're charging for a service and then not equally giving that service. They're discriminating on who gets that service.
Right.
And so they're saying, no, well, you have the service, you're paying the same amount, but we're going to restrict your access of who's allowed to see your how you're going to be given access to that service based on essentially religious perspective.
And who wants to be involved in a business deal? Who wants to be in a business deal with people who are not going to treat your product fairly?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're broadcasting right now on Facebook Live, and we put it on YouTube, but if all those platforms available to us restrict access, then there's sort of issues that come up with monopoly rights that the government has dealt with in the past, and restriction that become problematic. So anyway, that's just something for people to be aware of and going out. So anyway, hey, Kavanaugh, now you've heard some...
he's going to kill us all.
I know, right?
We're going to die if he's elected to the chair.
I saw this video. So it was actually today that this guy went to a college campus, several days, 3-4 days ahead of when Trump announced. Mm-hmm. So Trump announced on like the 9th of July, I believe, that Kavanaugh was going to be his nominee for the Supreme Court. And they went like the previous week, so like a Friday or something like that, to a campus and said, hey, what do you think about the pick that the president has made today?
Right.
And you have all these students literally just saying like, yeah, I heard about that, or I saw that, and it's terrible. This guy's a racist, and this guy, it's a horrible decision, and it's just extending the thing. They're talking like, oh yeah, I was talking to my dad about that. I mean, they're actually giving facts about that. I know, I saw this. I read about his pick, and they're giving all this details. They're not just saying, oh, I don't know who the pick is. They're actually telling the people, interviewing them, I read up on this, and I know what I'm saying.
And I know who this guy is.
I know who this guy is.
Name hasn't been released yet.
And his name wasn't even released because it wasn't even announced yet.
And to make it even worse, even the people that night who were protesting him live on camera couldn't even write. They either write his name in, or they sent out messages where the name should be and just put XX. Yeah. So it didn't even matter.
The signs that they were holding in protest were made ahead of time.
And
they just filled in the blank.
It
didn't matter who.
It didn't matter who it was.
The dishonesty in this. A free society cannot survive with that kind of stuff. I mean, there's legit questions.
You say that.
Ask about
You say that, and I think that it's accurate. I don't think that we're really grasping the gravity and the magnitude of the moment that we are in the country, where I mean, we have a showpiece trial going on television right now.
Yeah. With,
know, the moment that you turn your television on, what side the people on the right are going to be on and what side the people on the left are going to be on. You know this.
That happened today, too. I saw a tweet. Somebody tweeted out a New York Times headline about the testimony going on today with, how do you pronounce it? Stroke. Yes, say his name. I've heard. I think they're saying Struck, but I think there's a new pronunciation now that we know. I don't know. Anyway, so he hadn't even started testimony yet. And this guy tweeted out the headline from the New York Times. Struck turns tables on GOP senators questioning him.
Without even starting.
It didn't even start. How did he turn the tables when it hadn't even started? So the dishonesty, it's in a free society. And people have to understand, too, we say this every time. It's almost like we have to. Mm-hmm. You did not vote for Trump.
Right.
All of us, you, myself, Ward, have had expressed, I've written on my blog my concerns about Trump's many different issues about Trump. I don't believe he reflects ultimately a Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. I said that before the election. I posted it before everything went on.
Sure.
Of the 16 candidates for Republican that were running, the only one lower than him was Jeb Bush.
Exactly.
That's the only one I had lower than Trump.
Well, I had a few lower than him, but he's near the bottom. By no, you know what I mean? I mean, so he's the one that you don't even expect to be there.
Our observation about the problems in these things are not based on I unequivocally support Trump and he's the hero and he's the savior of the world and all these other things. This is saying, look, we have to look at each of these things as they come and understand that in a free society we have to evaluate what goes on fairly, even if it's our ox that gets gored. And because there's more things more important than the person we vote in.
That's right. And what's amazing about it, listen. I was going to say this at a later time, but listen, I just want the truth to happen. I just want there to be justice.
Yeah.
That's really what I want. I am stunned at how Trump is governing. I'm stunned.
I'm a little bit too. I thought he'd be a little bit more pragmatic. He's a pragmatist and a populist. Mm-hmm. How he's stuck fairly strongly to sort of what would be considered a conservative agenda, and followed through. I thought he would compromise way more than he has. I'm actually stunned by that.
And then even listen, if you've been alive even a little bit, and you've had grandparents, particularly a grandfather who's been paying attention to world events throughout his lifetime. I've met a grandparent who's been politically engaged who has ever not railed against the UN or against our kowtowing to foreign countries. When I was a kid, that was just normal banter. And to listen to Donald Trump go to Europe and just be King Kong on the world stage was just, it's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And I get it on one side where people are angry because he's not the statesman that we hope. I know my wife is frustrated with the fact that he's not.
Which is a fine discussion to have.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't make him evil incarnate.
Exactly.
If he doesn't take somebody's political approach. It may make him wrong. It could make it bad.
It could make him impolite.
There could be negatives to that. There could be serious negatives to that.
But if you really look at what he's saying, he's asking Europe, how is it that you can ask us to be your protector on one hand and not even pay your dues to protect us from these people, but make side deals with these people to the tunes of billions of dollars that you want protection from us. Yeah. That's stuff that we talk about inside baseball at home. Yeah. You seldom see people bring it to their front door.
No, and exactly right.
You seldom see that.
Previous presidents have said the exact same things he said. The only thing he's done differently is actually confronted our allies
on camera
with what our politicians will say to us when they campaign.
Right.
So what most Europeans don't get when they see this is that these are all issues that we've discussed internally. The difference for a lot of people is he's actually just confronting them with it now. They just don't hear it because the media doesn't express it that way in that they're hearing. So it's all crazy.
And what's amazing to me, and I'll say this last part about it before we get back to Kavanaugh.
Oh, yeah, we're going to get to that.
If you think of John Kerry's diplomacy, I think of him holding the mic and James Taylor bent over playing the song. What's the song? You Got a Friend? And how horrible. Just Google it. John Kerry and James Taylor. and they were singing a song to
John Kerry was actually singing.
Oh no, James Taylor was singing it,
Oh.
bent over on the microphone that John Kerry was holding, and I was just like, that is just brutal. That was horrible. Versus, and if you think that Donald Trump is bad by bringing this nonsense to their front door, just look at that video. That video that's horrible. That is.
I have not seen it.
As my friend,
I'll have to check it out.
It's one of my friend pastors say that's terrible.
Terrible. If you're Charles Barkley, it's terrible.
Oh, it's terrible. It's crazy.
So anyhow, on Kavanaugh,
right.
I think there's something to be said. I know that a lot of politically conservative, Christian conservative folks who want to see Roe v. Wade overturned, which I would agree with.
I want to see Amy Coney Barrett. I would rather have saw her.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of people are worried about Kavanaugh. But this is what came to attention, and I hadn't really said anything prior to this point on Kavanaugh's opinion because I wanted to try to read up on some things first. Unlike most people, I like to think through things before I have an opinion.
Seriously.
And not just take my opinion from politicians like, oh, I like that guy, he has an opinion, I'll just agree with that. Try to do it. But so here's the sort of concern that many have. At least this is what I read on a friend's Facebook. They had reported that Kavanaugh's record of, they're reporting from a news report, said Kavanaugh's record of public statements and legal decisions on abortion rights is relatively thin. That makes it difficult to say with certainty whether he would vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. So to those who want to see it overturned, as we would agree with, no problem with that. This is their concern. By the way, overturning Roe v. Wade is not making it illegal. Overturning Roe v. Wade would not make it illegal.
It's kicking it back to the states.
It just return it to the states. So just please understand that, people. Anyway, so in his confirmation hearing from May 2006, Kavanaugh was asked by Senator Chuck Schumer, who's the Democrat from New York, if he considered Roe v. Wade an abomination. Trying to get that biblical word in there, trying to trip him up on religious rights, religious grounds type thing. And Kavanaugh said this: if confirmed to the D.C. Circuit, I would follow Roe v. Wade faithfully and fully. That would be binding precedent of the court. And then Kavanaugh said, referring to the legal principle stare decisis, it's been decided by the Supreme Court.
Stare decisis, yes.
So here's the thing: what people and I posted. That's funny because I posted this, what I'm about to tell you, and this guy who is just this rabid, I think, kind of the worst kind of unthinking conservative person, just went off on this whole thing because he didn't realize I'm on the same side as you. I just said, look, I think actually his response is the correct response for somebody who's a strict constitutionalist. Here's why: because when you are appointed to a lower court, you use precedent for your decisions, but what's binding is majority precedent.
Right.
Now, what most people don't realize is dissenting opinions also count as legal precedent. So the dissent from Roe v. Wade is also considered legal precedent, as in other dissenting opinions can be. But when you're on the lower court, you're bound by that sort of what the majority has decided is the consensus.
And that majority being for him the Supreme Court.
He can't say on a lower court that what the U.S. Supreme Court said is unconstitutional.
Right.
So he has to follow that. So because conservative people don't understand that oh my goodness, he believes in it. It's people have to learn to think and process this stuff. This guy that by the way went off on me was like, that's the problem. The court makes things, and this is why we revolted. And he's going back to all this revolutionary language. I'm like,
what's amazing about that is
crazy.
If he takes his argument out to its logical conclusion, he's no different than the leftists that he's arguing with, because the leftists say, forget what the law or forget what the precedent is.
He's asking him you should overturn it because you disagree with it.
Right, and that's not what law is about.
So Kavanaugh was right. But what folks have to understand is, on the Supreme Court, because all precedent, both majority and the dissent, are considered legal precedent, he, as a Supreme Court person, can overturn a previous decision.
That's right.
Because then he has that authority. So
if the case comes before him.
If the proper case, which is why he can't even say he would overturn it, because he doesn't know.
If the proper case comes before them, or they convinced if he convinces 4 other Supreme Court justices to retake up a case that's been which they never happened. Right.
So that's what people first got to get. Walk yourselves off the ledges. Try to take effort. I mean this sincerely. We have to understand what it is we're arguing about, and stop spreading like fear and rumors and gossip about. He made this statement and it's really concerning. my reading of it is that his statement is in line with a strict constitutionalist, has nothing to do with what he would decide on the Supreme Court.
That's right.
Which is what scares people a little bit. It does me too. I mean, he was a Bush appointee, which is always questionable. I'm not a huge Bush.
Oh, that was your wife. Your wife was cheering in. Way to go, Suzanne.
My wife. She doesn't normally she teaches piano on Wednesdays.
Okay.
So we're on an off day today, so she might have got a chance to.
There you go.
Tune in.
At least we got at least one viewer, Suzanne.
Yeah, I know, right?
There we are.
Now, if your wife would just pay attention.
Well, no, she's not watching.
I know. She doesn't.
Working, she's working. She doesn't love me anymore.
Yeah, my wife has to work most days too. So, so what I wanted to look at for all those people that are basically what they want to say is, oh, well, this is settled law. This is settled law. You can't go against it. He's right for a lower court to say that. But in terms of the Supreme Court, there is no such thing as settled law.
Right.
If there was, we would still be under Dred Scott.
Exactly.
Even though technically the Constitution was amended which overturned Dred Scott, so there was no actual... The Supreme Court never got a chance to correct itself. There is other precedent for the Supreme Court overturning itself, which is not much, but there is reason for it. But there's a connection. This is what I want to bring up. Even though Dred Scott wasn't overturned by a later decision directly, the precedent that it set in the majority has been overturned.
Right.
The foundational points in the majority decision have been rejected. And that's very important that people understand this. So just to set the stage, here's a little bit of Dred Scott that I put together to give people an understanding. So originally, it's Dred Scott versus Sandford. It's a legal case decided by the Supreme Court on March 6th, 1857.
1857.
So the Supreme Court in that case reversed the lower court decision, which ruled that Scott, the lower court said that Scott was not forced. He was in Illinois, which was a free state, and he was from Missouri. And the lower court said, yes, he's free. He has the rights to sue. He's free now. He cannot be forced to return to be a slave in Missouri. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court, 7-2, a strong majority of the sacred court, said no, that he did not have the right to contest this, and he should be returned to his slave owner. So this was the majority, 7-2, of the Supreme Court that decided this. So here's 3 key parts about the SCOTUS ruling that I wanted to bring up. First, it said that Scott was not entitled to his freedom because as a slave, he had no legal standing to bring the lawsuit to begin with.
Right.
Okay, that's their first thing. He said, so the judge, if you read the majority opinion, which I don't know if you have, but the majority opinion essentially was that, well, you were parents of a slave. Your parents came from Africa. Mm-hmm. They were slaves. Therefore, you have no standing
because you're not a citizen.
Now, the dissenting opinion, one of the dissenting opinions, basically said, "Well, that's a lot. That's a non sequitur. Essentially, It's not his words, but it's a non sequitur. It's like even if his parents were slaves, he could have been born in a free state, or he could have been born somewhere else. So, as a freeman, or he could have been freed, emancipated prior to that, which would give him standing. So, just by him agreeing, because the whole point was that." He agreed to the fact that his parents were slaves. Therefore, the court said that proves he had no standing. But it didn't prove anything because
it just proved that
his parents were slaves. So it's an irrational decision. So that idea about standing off of that was important because that's come up before. And I think as religious people, conservatives, politically, whatever, we get so hung up on the moral or religious point to be made that we miss the subtleties of what's happening legally.
Sure.
California, do you remember a few years back when we as the voters voted on, was it Prop 8?
Right.
That made marriage between
a man and a woman.
And what happened was it was challenged, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Brown was still the governor at the time.
No.
Was it Schwarzenegger? Okay, yeah. So what happened, though, was that got taken to the Supreme Court. And the attorneys general
within California.
Yeah, well here, but it also went to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right.
Because the Supreme Court of California said, no, it's unconstitutional, can't do it. Well, that was taken to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the attorneys general from the California said, we won't represent that case. Even though it's the legally binding case on us, they would not represent the voters who had done that. So the voters, the people that initially made the proposition, tried to go and take the case before the Supreme Court. And do you remember what the ruling was?
They didn't have standing.
They said, the Supreme Court said, you, the voters of California, and I wrote this on my blog, is the problem was not about gay marriage at that point.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that Christians got fixated, it made it legal, whatever. No, the problem was the Supreme Court ruled that the voters in California did not have standing
outside of their duly elected representatives.
So even though the voters had the right to vote something into law, they said you don't have the standing to defend that law. So anytime the government says we're not going to defend that existing law, so basically told California, the governor, we can pass all the propositions we want here. Because if they just choose not to defend them legally, they'll be meaningless.
Right.
So it was a terrible thing. So this is a trick, I think, this is a continual problem of leftists, that they refuse to grant people their standing, and they refuse to recognize their rights, their basic right, and they use that to take away rights. They did it for Dred Scott. They said, you don't have a legal standing because you're a black man. You can't have standing before the court. You don't have a legal foot stand, just as was done to the voters in California. Said, you don't have standing before us. So we're not going to rule on the merits of the case. We're just saying you don't have the right to even come before and defend yourself.
Defend the case, right. Well,
that was the first problem.
But that is, I was going to say, it's very interesting about leftists. Leftism is all about bondage. It's all about slavery. It is all about, they what they call care and compassion and concern literally means slavery and bondage and destruction. Because, and when I say destruction, I mean destruction of your rights to be free.
Yeah.
Because they always want to bring in bondage under some idea that is almost in opposition to the Constitution. They always want to bring you in bondage. For example, they wanted us to pay taxes on health care. Even if you don't need health care or you don't want health care, they're going to force you to get it. Because in their view, they think that they have the right to do that.
Yeah, the right to constrain rights based on just law, even if it's a violation of the Constitution. So I think that was interesting about Dred Scott, and it carries on to several cases today. This
question is always before us.
So here was the second line of argument used by the majority to say that Dred Scott must remain a slave even though he was in a free state. So they said that blacks could not and could never be considered citizens of the United States. That's what essentially the rule. He ruled that just because you're black, you cannot be a citizen.
So you know what this means? That if we really believe that no laws can be overturned, then we should still be under Dred Scott.
Yeah, well, Taney, who was the justice, he said this, that the blacks could not become a citizen, and they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So this is the majority decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, the hallowed sacred place of leftism, where anything the majority says must be upheld forever. Mm-hmm. You can't. It's established law.
Especially if you want to stick with that line of reasoning.
If that's your line of reasoning, yes, it's established law. Dred Scott was established law, and so had we not amended the Constitution, leftists would say, well, that's the law. It's the Supreme Court has ruled that we must stand by. So that's a problem.
When I bring up the idea of stare decisis, meaning asking you, is it settled law? The Supreme Kavanaugh should always say it is settled law, because guess what? It's settled.
Yeah.
Until another case comes before me.
That's exactly what folks that I was responding on Facebook did not get. I was trying to explain it, and of course, you're just a part of the problem because you're just don't understand. This is what we're fighting against: is judicial tyranny.
No, we do understand. Blah. We do understand. That's the problem.
But people, we get on leftist people who are, maybe can't comprehend complex issues like free speech.
Sure.
The same as people on the right who can't understand complex ideas.
Like the way the law works.
The way the law works. And just because you're trying to work within the law doesn't mean that you don't want rights or free. It's just we got to be balanced and thoughtful.
Or at least we've had to think through or work past the desire to just have to say something.
Yeah. Yeah, just because it's, I got to say the first thing that comes to my mind is, oi. So Justice McLean, in his dissent to Taney, pointed out that 5 of the 13 U.S. states, by the way, he's like 5 of the 13 original states, gave blacks the right to vote at the time that the U.S. Constitution was ratified. So blacks actually had the right to vote in 5 of the 13 colonies. So his point was this idea that somehow blacks could not, he's saying therefore de facto they had the rights of citizens.
Sure.
So what he's saying is the Supreme Court making this ruling was a rejection of actually standing precedent of law, of established law. But it didn't matter because that's what the Supreme Court ruled, because then he was not in the majority. So again, I think we got to understand reading this, just because a decision has been made by the majority of a bunch of judges does not even make it a right decision legally, nor does it make it permanently binding for all ages.
And that's the beauty,
especially if it ignores other.
That's the beauty. That's the beauty of our system. We are not bound by mistakes. We can actually go back and revisit them and see if there is a different decision that could be made.
So the third point of this, which I actually didn't know this part about Dred Scott. Maybe you did. I didn't know. But
I probably did.
It says basically part of the ruling was that the Missouri Compromise, which was done in 1820 itself, Taney ruled was unconstitutional. So the Missouri Compromise essentially said all the new territories that are going to be north of latitude 36 degrees, 30 minutes was making those free states. He said that was unconstitutional. You can't make slavery unconstitutional. You can't make slavery against the law in these new states in the Missouri Compromise.
But pro-law, but the law in the other states.
Yes.
Right.
So that's one of those decisions that led us closer to civil war because, again, saying that slavery was illegal in any new state.
Right.
Dred Scott said that's illegal. And I didn't realize that came from that case.
I didn't know it came from that case. I do know that was a compromise that was floated and was still rejected.
Thus called the Missouri Compromise.
Right.
Yeah, well, this is Dred Scott is what made that so then controversial. The Supreme Court unanimously, or not unanimously, but the majority decision, 7-2, said, you can't just make a law that says slavery is illegal.
Sure.
You have to allow the people to decide. And so that was another one of those problems. So here's the thing from Encyclopedia Britannica. I just got some basic summary of them. They even say this: among constitutional scholars, Scott versus Sandford, which is Dred Scott, was widely considered the worst decision ever rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court, and have been cited in particular as the most egregious example of the court's history of wrongly imposing a judicial solution on a political problem. Mm-hmm. That's key. So making judges decide via the pretending it's in the Constitution, a decision that should be rightly decided through the political process, made that decision wrong.
And that's why we're where we are today with Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is, again, one of those laws that is poorly written. You listen to any legal scholar, and they will tell you that it is one of the worst poorly written decisions on implementing Roe v. Wade. And it's simply because it was implemented the way it was. Yeah. We're still fighting about it. Yeah. Every single election, every single debate, it is the first thing that comes up because it was foisted upon us by the judiciary rather than having it come up through the states. And that's exactly why it needs to be kicked back to the states.
Understanding this beyond just, Dred Scott was wrong because that's racist. See, that's such a superficial analysis. Yes, racism is wrong, but that's not what made the decision. That's a moral decision. Mm-hmm. The legal reason for why it was wrong is 3 of those reasons we just talked about. Understanding why it was legally
the judiciary does not
wrong.
Make the laws.
Exactly.
Right.
Those same principles then must be applied to Roe v. Wade and any other case. Mm-hmm. For example, you know what Plessy versus Ferguson is.
That's right.
Decided in 1890 or decided 1896.
The Board of Education.
Plessy versus Ferguson declared racial segregation constitutional. Wrong. They say, according to the Constitution, you can separate based on skin color. Blacks can have the black-only drinking fountain, and blacks have to have their own stores and their own. They can't eat at a white person's table. That is a decision from the Supreme Court of the United States. Majority decision said it's okay to have separate but equal.
Should have been kicked back to the states.
Yeah, which was later overturned. Sure. One of those cases that was overturned and not done constitutionally, but by later courts.
That's right.
So the idea that precedent is settled law, irrevocable for all time, is meaningless. So going back to the original point with Kavanaugh, he was right to say that on a lower court, he would take the majority decision of Roe v. Wade as settled law because he has to from a lower court perspective. That doesn't mean he would overturn it, given that. We have no idea what he'd actually do. But that statement in and of itself is not reason to think that he could not, because he's not legally bound to not.
He's just saying that within the rules and the way the judicial system works.
Exactly.
I have to rule, and not only do I have to say this, regardless of what my personal opinion may be, it is the law.
Yes.
And if we're going to be a nation of laws and not men, then I have to follow the law.
Yes. So he actually answered properly for a lower court as a strict constructionist would and should answer. Mm-hmm. Now, also a liberal would answer that same way. Oh, sure. But the reasons he answered are what we know is different. And that's why we have to look at other cases and precedent to know his reasons for saying it's established law at that level. Now, here's where it's interesting, because this goes directly to what could happen at the Supreme Court level. So Antonin Scalia, Justice Antonin Scalia of the Supreme Court, has made comparison between Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was a 1992 decision, and the Dred Scott decision specifically. Mm-hmm. So he's made a correlation between majority decisions by the Supreme Court and has said these decisions are flawed for the same reason Dred Scott is the flawed. He said this. Dred Scott rested upon the concept of substantive due process. That the court, in other words, it was relying on this idea of like who could have the right to, like we talked about that first premise, standing and those such things. But the court process, what was the right place of the court versus the law, those sort of things. So he's talking about those issues. He said the concept of substantive due process that the court supporting Roe v. Wade praises and embodies today. So the court today is praising Roe v. Wade for something in the same way, and on the same foundation of which we would reject Dred Scott.
That's exactly right.
He's noting the right hypocrisy in that if you support Roe v. Wade, you're supporting the same legal foundation
that Dred Scott was founded on.
So, because he says Dred Scott was very possibly the first application of substantive due process in Supreme Court, the original precedent for Roe v. Wade.
Substantive meaning that the Supreme Court is standing in for the people.
Yes, exactly. Right. Because what they essentially did was said, we're going to make this decision again in those three areas.
Sure.
Basically, that you have no standing, we're going to stand in your stead.
Right.
And so he's saying, look, if Roe v. Wade relies on that same principle, which is nowhere else in the law except for Dred Scott. Well, not nowhere else, but first appeared in Roe v. Wade.
I wonder if a Obergefell is based on the same thing. I wonder.
Well, actually, look at this. You are a wise man. Mm-hmm. Chief Justice John Roberts, currently on the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, compared Obergefell. That's a hard word to say.
Obergefell.
Right? Obergefell. Say that really fast. Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015. He compared it to the Dred Scott case as well. As another example of trying to settle a contentious issue, which is a political issue, through a ruling that went beyond the scope of the Constitution. So people have to understand when conservative, constitutionalist people, legal conservatives, legal conservatives, are arguing about being faithful to the Constitution, and it's a living document, it's a breathing document, is the liberal sort of response.
Sure.
If it's a living, breathing document, then Dred Scott can be a valid decision.
Right.
And that's not hyperbole. That's not, I'm painting and broad brushing all liberals as wanting slavery, because it's not about slavery. I agree that they wouldn't want slavery. They're not supporters of racism. That's not the charge. Bringing up Dred Scott is not to make the charge towards liberals of endorsing slavery or racism. It's
simply saying that there's a logic that undergirds Dred Scott.
Yes.
That should have, versus Sandford, that should have been rejected. That same logic that undergirds Dred Scott undergirds Plessy versus Ferguson, and that same
Roe v. Wade,
Obergefell and Roe v. Wade, and that same way, that same logic, which was rejected by the courts, should also hold sway in rejecting these other later two.
The same foundation. So for the people opposed to this idea of strict, original intent, strict constitutionalist type things, that is the only foundation for rejecting Plessy versus Ferguson. Because again, Dred Scott was never actually overruled by the Supreme Court. It was only through amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But the foundation for rejecting and overruling a previous court ruling, Plessy, was through that lens of
it's bad law,
strict constitutionalism.
It's bad law.
It is also the same foundation under which Roberts and Scalia, and who knows what Kavanaugh would do, but under which they could do that. So hopefully, hopefully that makes sense to people. Go ahead and email us or write us or put comments, whatever, if that's not clear. But I think that's the case I would want to make using this issue. Again, we have to be so careful, though. I'm not saying, please don't anybody post, you liberals, you are one of racism, and you're supporting race. It's not the argument to be made. It's not intellectually rigorous, and it's dishonest.
The argument is that if we believe in the rule of law, and if we believe that we are a nation of laws and not merely men,
yes,
then we need to follow the law. I can't recall who it was, but it was Scalia. And they asked Scalia, what makes us exceptional? And Scalia goes on and people make suggestions about what makes us exceptional. Maybe it's our Constitution that makes us exceptional, and maybe it's several other things. But what he said that made us exceptional was really a shock to me. What he said was that it was the separation of powers, that you had three equal branches of government that did not have rule over each other.
Yes.
That means that one branch of government is responsible for making the laws. The other branch is responsible for judging whether a law made is really a law. And the other branch executes the laws.
Yes.
What we've done in our country is we've elevated the Supreme Court to the highest branch. And we're making the Supreme Court, the Super Bowl. If you get a Supreme Court justice on, you've won the Super Bowl, because we've made them into what we call a super legislator, where you'll have activist judges on the bench. Now, I think that the freak out by putting Kavanaugh on the bench is instructive. If you're paying attention, it's instructive. If you look at the law or the Supreme Court like we have to pack the bench with people who are favorable to our side, then when your side doesn't get a seat, then you should see the liberal or the conservative freak out about what happens on the court. But if you put men and women on the court who will adjudicate the law, who will be, as we say, strict constructionists and not attempt to read rights into the laws that do not exist, then what you'll end up getting is freedom for everybody.
Yeah. Because
you'll only get people who are interested in bringing out, exegeting the law as it is, rather than reading rights in. Imagine if we were putting onto the court men instead of an originalist or a textualist, as they say. Imagine if we were putting in conservatives who just really want a conservative view.
That would be bad.
That would be bad too.
It would be a tragic flaw, because they would have a political ideology instead of a legal
and we'd be a nation of
foundation.
Men instead of.
It would be terrible.
I
wouldn't want just an unthinking conservative who
just
may agree with me about many things on the court, who had no legal intellect or mind.
Because here's what I think.
That would be tragically flawed.
I think that liberals need to be protected from me. What do I mean by that? You don't want me.
I need to be protected from
right, but you don't want me being a conservative just ruling from a conservative bent on liberal deals. If that were the case, you wouldn't feel like the law was fair.
Yeah.
In the same way, I don't want a liberal adjudicating my issues, because again, I don't think that a liberal will see the world the way as I do. What I really want is a person who will adjudicate the law
Yeah.
For what it is.
Here's why
exegete the law.
Here's why it's important is because we understand, and it's been said many times by other people, that we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic.
Right.
Which means the Constitution is the foundation for, our legal matters. It's the legal foundation. It's the legal authority in those things. And all of us are constrained by what is there in terms of rights. Not in a negative sense, but in a positive sense. So we can't infringe on each other's natural rights. And so when we add things to that that aren't contained within, it's diminishing the rights of other people. Right. So, for example, here's the thing: what people are really arguing when they're saying, "Oh, the court decided 7-2," and Dred Scott, they're saying, "Well, that settles it." What they're arguing is in the tyranny of the majority. Just because 7 people out of 2 or 9 out of none or whatever the majority is at that case make a decision about something doesn't make it right, because it goes back to exactly what you said.
Right.
There's 3 branches; they're accountable to one another. So we're no longer left. It's why we can go back to this last election. Everybody, all of us, Trump didn't win because he didn't get the majority of the votes.
Right.
And you see this bent from leftists, not necessarily liberals, because technically I think in some ways I would be considered, like if you look at liberalism of the 60s or 70s even, probably I might fall within that in many categories, politically speaking. I don't know, there's some things I would.
For liberal,
huh? In that sense of what it was maybe.
Really?
In some senses.
I kind of figured it.
No. Depends on how you define it.
You'd be
but
surprised.
Leftism today is very much non-liberal.
It's non-liberal. It's
not
progressive.
Liberal. The left. But I just finished that. So they went nuts on the whole. It should have been her because we got to abolish the idea of the what is the word I'm looking for, the electoral college. Do you know that? And I wrote a post on this at the time, researching this. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, and Abraham Lincoln made this Emancipation Proclamation, do you know what the rallying cry of the South was at the time and the slaveholders?
No electoral college.
Eliminate the electoral college.
That's right.
We need a pure vote, because they would have won. Lincoln would not have been in if there was no electoral college. And it was the slaveholding South that wanted to abolish the electoral college. It's the total misunderstanding of history. It's why blacks were considered 3/5 of a vote. That was the South wanted blacks to have the full right to vote,
and the North did not.
And it's not
for good reason.
Because if the South would have had every black the right for blacks to vote, who do you think the slaves would have voted for,
or been forced to vote for?
Exactly.
So the North compromised, and it's such a backwards idea when you hear people talk about that, because you know that they don't know what they're talking
about.
That's
why leftists are so nuts with the whole issue.
It was a maneuver to prevent the South from gaining more power
and making slavery legal where it wasn't legal.
Right.
It was an effort by the North to constrain slavery, to limit its influence and power.
It's the most ridiculous thing.
And so people say, they weren't even considered fully human. It's not the argument at all that was used. It's such presentism, reading back into the present some moral thing and not even recognizing the historical context. But anyway, I would say,
and this is what I say to people to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. I am not for gay marriage. I would never have voted for gay marriage. I would never even suggest that our country have gay marriage. But you know what I say to our fellow gay citizens? Our fellow gay citizens, I say, if you believe the country ought to be X, Y, and Z with gay marriage, because you're a citizen of this country the same way that I'm a citizen of this country, and you have rights in this country the same way that I have rights, you are free to go out and pursue that view. I don't particularly agree with it, but I agree with your right to pursue happiness for you. But don't think that I'm not going to go out and try to change the voters and influence people to vote against your view. But we live in a free society.
Yeah,
where people are free to exercise.
Very different.
To exercise their, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You ought to pursue those things that make you happy. And if you go to the ballot box and you lose, so be it. If I go to the ballot box and lose, don't think that that's the end of it. I'm going to try to get the laws overturned. I'm going to work through my legislature in the same way that you do, and that you should.
Everyone should, though,
because America is not a theocracy.
That was the ideal of why we get a peaceable transition of power.
Right.
It's because I don't have to agree with what the law is. I can overturn. I can do, legally protest, do all the things necessary, get public opinion or sway it whatever way possible. But I can do that without resorting to violence because I always have recourse.
I can always go to the courts.
As long as the government is constrained by the law itself.
Right.
As soon as the government becomes unconstrained, it becomes some sort of dictatorship, whether it's a court dictatorship or a presidential dictatorship, as soon as that happens, we lose the right for peaceable transition and change of the law.
And we lose what makes
us... And it's going to get things ugly.
We lose what makes us exceptional as a country. We lose it.
Yeah.
And then you have, and getting back, bringing this full circle, then you have entities like Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube who want to get in the middle, want to get between our rights to say what we want to say. Even if people find it objectionable, they want to get in between and they want to limit and they want to restrict our access to speak to people. If you ask me, they should be broken apart because they stepped into an arena they do not have the right to be in. They're a free country. It's a free country. They have the right to have managed these platforms how they see fit. But they need to be honest in how they're managing these platforms, number one. Number two, they need to be regulated in the same way that other institutions that are editors of material, editors of content, like the news media and everybody else, need to be regulated in the same way. Because essentially what we're developing is an unelected bureaucracy who is limiting our rights as citizens to say and have our words heard. So if you ask me, I love Facebook. I love Twitter. I love the fact that, we can connect with people, all over the world. I mean, we live at an unprecedented time where we can speak to some of the greatest Americans who've ever lived, and talk to celebrities and talk to influential people, via social media and have them respond to us. I think that's awesome. I think we live in a time when we get to share information back and forth. That's awesome. But what's being infringed upon is the very thing that makes us exceptional. And I think any reasonable person, if you love this country, whether you're on the right or the left, you should be against that view. Because the moment that someone else who is an opposing view to yours takes the levers of power, the ones that you're using against your fellow citizens, and then they begin to do it to you, then you'll understand why this is all wrong. This is just madness. Anyway.
No, that's important. So we only have a few minutes left.
I wanted to say one more thing.
Okay.
This is very interesting. This is Kavanaugh.
Oh, I know.
Turn on the news, and every time you turn
Just
around...
look at the camera up there. You're looking at the microphone. See,
the
video
microphone.
and audio. That's the difference.
Well, see, because I'm speaking to you. I'm speaking to you.
Don't speak to microphones. I'm going to put a face on that camera up there, and then you'll know who to look at.
Okay, but here's what's interesting.
Just pretend he's looking at you. He really is looking at you.
just think. What's funny? Here's the funniest thing in the world. People are going on television and telling you that if we elect this guy Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, that people are going to die. Everybody, they're going to die. We're going to die if you elect him to office. I'm going to tell you something. That is a lie. 700,000 people a year are put to death because of Roe v. Wade. If you elect him to that seat, 700,000 people will not die. That is a lie. You think about that. They're lying to you. People will not die.
Yeah.
It's exactly the opposite. Anyhow.
By the way, that was a lovely speech, but Jeremiah just wants to say he's looking. So he just wanted to point out that he sees you. He sees you looking. So,
you see me looking at you there, Dr. Jeremiah?
So anyway.
I did have... Do we have time or are we over?
No. We have a few minutes left.
Oh, because I have something.
Do you have one story? Hey, before we do that, let's make sure we have time. I wanted to mention one thing. We did have somebody... one of the folks that does watch us and view, and
one of the few
that got
through the filters.
Right. No, but we sent me a message and asking for prayer about a specific circumstance. It was funny because they have a colleague at work who was a lesbian woman who decided that she was going to become a man and wants to use the men's restroom and stuff. But it's ironic that so there's a woman who liked women, now she wants to transition to a man, but she's also decided that she likes men now. So she was a lesbian woman, now she wants to become a gay man. But technically she's still a woman who likes it's very
confusing. It's just really...
So, and I don't say that to make fun of the situation at all. I'm not making light of that. It's a genuine prayer thing. He's like, how do I deal with this? How do I approach this? And it's a secular company. There's nothing like it's not
right.
As a believer, you could say, oh, that's wrong or immoral, but it's not like you're going to say, no, I refute whatever. So there's so many people facing that kind of challenge. Under this midst of social upheaval,
the answers aren't easy.
Praying for, and there's no easy answer. But
the answers are not easy. As a matter of fact, I won't say that story. The answers just aren't easy, and they absolutely do require thought. It may be for that person that you need to be very specific in the times that you plan to use the restroom if you want to avoid that situation. You may determine that being at work is not a place where you will use the restroom. So
it's no easy solution, though.
There isn't.
And we can't simplify that with any particular answer. I just wanted to bring it up because I know that others who do listen are facing those same kind of challenges in their work environments, being faithful. I mean, there's nothing that makes you an unfaithful Christian to have that person as a colleague at work. Right. There's nothing that makes you an unfaithful Christian to even eventually share a bathroom with that person. Maybe awkward, and maybe, like you said, different times, or whatever. But it's not incumbent upon us to force that on a non-believer. There are other responses that might be good, but there's no need for us to force that.
Deal with us and how we respond to that situation, rather than attempting to force other people.
Yeah, there's a lot can happen with to us respond before we worry about the other.
That's exactly that's where I was coming from.
Yeah.
Because you have control over everything that you do and how you respond to those situations. But I will make one suggestion. Spend some time thinking through way ahead of time how you're going to respond in those situations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Don't get caught up in the moment without having determined how you would respond ahead of time. And if you do that, you'll find that the time that you spend thinking, you'll come up with a far more reasonable answer and loving answer than having to respond in the moment.
I agree with that fully. All right, last story. We have a couple minutes left for.
We'll say that this was an article that came in.
Oh, a tease for the next show.
This came in the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal is a very interesting newspaper because you're going to find conservative stories in the Wall Street Journal. You're going to find libertarian stories in the Wall Street Journal. You're going to find some liberal stories in the Wall Street Journal.
I had one of my best friends in high school, Omar. His name was Omar. His dad was Egyptian. He's Omar, and he actually would bring the Wall Street Journal to class when he was like 16 years old. He would read that. He loved that thing. Anyway,
but it's just
all the financial news.
It's not all financial news.
But as I'm saying, he loved all the financial news. He would read all the stock stuff, and that's what he read at like 16, 17.
The story that came out as a result of Judge Kavanaugh's, and again, I won't go too deeply into it, but it'll be something that we'll think of.
Carried over, yeah.
But it's called "Let's Talk About the Abortion Rate," and let's talk about the black abortion rate. Now, I bring these stories up because I grew up in the 1970s and really became an adult in the late 80s and early 90s.
To quote Steve Martin.
Yeah,
I was born.
Yeah, exactly. But it was exactly. But I just don't recognize the America that I grew up in. I'm sorry. I mean, don't get me wrong. I grew up in Southwest Philadelphia. I grew up in the hood.
Born and raised. It's in his profile. We don't think.
I knew some of the guys in the Will Smith video. I mean, that part of some of those guys I went to high school with. One of the guys I lived. But I grew up in the hood. I understand. But when we grew up,
you were the soft part of the hood, West Philadelphia.
No. We grew up in Southwest Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah, that's the thug one. See, I forget.
North Philly. We keep bringing North Philly is where all the
North Philly
is where you needed to go armed. I mean, let's just be real. I'm just guys who know that.
And then West Philadelphia.
It was all the pretty boys.
That's the pretty boys.
That's all the pretty boys.
Yeah, that's pretty boys.
Right.
You were from the.
I was really from the middle. I mean, Southwest Philly is
tough, but not.
It's not North Philly.
It's
not. Well, there was gangs. Don't get me wrong.
But not the.
No, it was gangs. It was gangs in Southwest Philadelphia. Okay. The mob, 5-3 mob, the Zip. Woodland Avenue. No, they were gangs.
Okay.
So you did your best to avoid it.
There's an education on Philly geography.
So the point being, I can still remember men saying to me, when you get a job somewhere, you gotta go somewhere and work hard, because if you go there and you mess up, they're not going to hire another black guy if you go into that job. I remember that when I was a teenager. I remember listening to men talk about, delayed gratification. Not all of these were perfect men. Many of these guys were drunks or boozers, and they would tell you, "Don't become like me. Don't do the things that I did." And I took them to heart, because I believe them. I believe that their lives didn't end up the way that they thought they would. And I thought that you had to make, different decisions to be successful. And I can remember my teachers, reinforcing those messages in grade school and in high school. And I look at some of the decisions that we're making today, particularly within the black community, and I don't understand it. I understand that there's always been an idea that we don't want other people to criticize us, because if people criticize us, they're reinforcing the things that we already think about us. So we reject generally the criticism from outsiders, people who are not outside the black community. But I will make the suggestion: if we are ever to change and we're ever to become the people that we think that we can become, we need to start listening to criticism. And I'll just read one paragraph.
Okay, this will be our
closing. And this will be the closing. This paragraph says, among civil rights activists today, talk of black self-destructive behavior is unpopular and minimal. Writing in Commentary magazine last month, Jason Hill, a professor of philosophy at DePaul University, noted the hypocrisy of groups like Black Lives Matter, who want white people to esteem black lives and value the humanity of black people, when they themselves can't condemn and express moral outrage at those who maim and kill black children in the course of gang warfare, senseless street violence, and drive-by shootings. And there's a lot more that goes with that. But
we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that.
So a little over.
No, that's all right. So thanks for everyone joining this week. Off the Cuff has been good. I think
it's really good that Ward's not here.
Yeah,
no, we hope he's not here.
Is he gone next week again?
Let's hope so.
Is this already week 2 in a row? Time just seems to fly without him. So
yeah, when he's not here, it's just a fun.
So
series.
We'll be back though We should be back Wednesday next week. We had to put it off this week, but thanks for and again, please, if you could share the show, links to it, because certainly being restricted on YouTube and other places through Facebook it makes it tough. So any kind of organic kind of things folks can do to help us out, we appreciate it. So, all right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Back to work.